Good
All right.
evening.
Yeah.
Sure.
Ready to go. Go.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Tools and Techniques hosted by the Johannesburg region. We are pleased to have Dr. Rael Futerman with us today, and he will be taking us through the session looking at a topic called creating an open lifelong learning strategy. And just a little bit more about our speaker today, Dr. Rael Futerman. He is a co-founder and chief learning officer at Catador, an organization specializing in the 21st century soft skills development. His work lies at the intersection of learning experience design and human-centered design thinking, and focuses on helping people develop transferable skills and mindset critical for thriving in the VUCA world. He designs and runs virtual and blended programs in design thinking, venture design, innovative entrepreneur, and creative leadership. He is an outstanding researcher and an educator. So we are so pleased to have Dr. Rael Futerman with us this evening. And before I could just hand over to him, I'd like us to just go through some house rules. So we are requested to remain muted all the time, and only our speaker video will be allowed to be on while our videos will be off. And the presentation will take 45 minutes long, with an opportunity for us to go through questions at the end of his presentation. And we kindly ask that you can then post any questions on the chat or any comments, which will be read by our amazing team at the end. As you might know by now that we are streaming live on YouTube. So if you would like to have access to this session, you can access it via YouTube page by just looking through our IIBSA YouTube page. If you would like to become our member, you can easily join, our IIBA membership through our website. And lastly, if you would like to participate and become one of our guests here, we greatly encourage that you then send through your details on our Johannesburg at southafrica.iiba.org. And now I am so pleased and honored to then hand over to Dr. Rael Futerman, who will take us through this amazing session. Thank you. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to turn my camera on for a second here just to say hi, and just so everybody can see the face that goes along with my voice. I'm sure you'll be listening in. So just a wonderful, good evening to everybody. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, as I was saying, telling Seppo just now. And thank you to Seppo for that great introduction. I'm going to just share my screen, and I guess we can dive right in, and then have a little bit of a sort of discussion towards the end of this as well. So let me see if I can get this right again. All right. Hello. Just a quick check-in. We're just seeing a single screen, am I correct?
Yes, we are.
Fantastic. Let's turn my camera off then, and then I guess we can just dive right in. So yes, thank you for the invitation. As I was saying, this sort of intersection between learning theory, design thinking, data science, this is sort of where I get to play, and I love that. And this all comes together, I think, towards developing these lifelong learning strategies, and so it's wonderful that I'm able to sort of come and share some of my thinking on this theme with you. I think we all know the importance of becoming lifelong learners, or remaining lifelong learners, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly, and one where the learning pathways have shifted from sort of linear, school, university, work into all sorts of different ways. We're working and learning at the same time. Maybe we stop working, go back to school and what have you. So in this time when I think learning is far more fluid, how do we become curators of our own education? And I guess that's what I'm going to be speaking a little bit about this evening. So I think first of all, I'm just going to just a bit of background, and so you can understand where I'm coming from. So as Lesego mentioned, I'm a co-founder, Chief Learning Officer of Cartido, along with my co-founder, Shweta Homji. Shweta is based in India, in New Delhi, and I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. So we're a very distributed organization. And then we've also run programs in about 170 countries around the world with various partners, really focusing at scaling a blend of design thinking and challenge-based learning. So that young people predominantly, as has been our focus, working with organizations like UNICEF, are empowered to solve place-based challenges, often related to SDGs and also personal development. And so we do soft skills measurement online through these challenges. And yeah, that's the sort of the core of what we do. And so learning is something that I'm very much in love with. I do like to see myself as a lifelong learner. Having worn various hats throughout my life, from teaching, hardcore design back when product design was actually around sort of physical products, and then through to curriculum development, curriculum design, and more design thinking, business strategy. So that's been my role, have been my roles. And so yes, let's get stuck into this theme of lifelong learning. So, Henry Ford said, anyone who stops learning is old. Whether at 20 or 80, anyone who keeps learning stays young. And I think this is more true today than it probably was when Henry Ford said it. And I've met a lot of, I don't think age is a physical age is really an indicator of age as well. So, there's incredible people who go into their 80s who we can learn from. And I think if we approach learning more as a social, what's the word I'm looking for, activity, rather than just an academic one, we can start to learn across generations as well. And so what's important then is, how do we create an open, lifelong learning strategy? And I'm going to be approaching this from a personal space. So this is how do we apply to our own lives, less than a sort of a big organizational approach. And that's mainly because I think all organizations are different. They also all have their own personalities. And so I think, and also obviously also made up of individuals. So focusing on individuals, I think we can help to grow organizations and help organizations become learning organizations as well. And so what do we need to do to actually create an open lifelong learning strategy? So I'm touching on sort of three areas of growth this evening. The first is growing from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. The second is moving from pedagogical approaches to learning to heutagogical approaches. Shifting our roles from knowledge managers to knowledge strategists. And then shifting how we learn as well, from learning about to learning from and with. And I'm going to dig into each of these a little bit more. So don't worry about figuring out what these are right now. So let's start. I think the first one we're going to look at is around moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So this really references Carol Dweck's work that she's done around growth mindset. And to me, this is the starting point for lifelong learning. If we approach lifelong learning with a fixed mindset, it sits at odds with actually creating that lifelong learning. Lifelong learners need a growth mindset. And so the first step really is honest reflection on how we approach learning, how we approach the business world and our social worlds, and to look at, reflecting on ourselves. Do we avoid challenges? Do we give up easily when we start something? Do we say, oh, no, I'm not good at this, never mind, toss it aside and do something else? Do we see effort as fruitless? How persistent are we in actually learning something new? How many different types of ways do we try and learn it? The feedback, do we see that as negative or as something positive? Do we see it as negative criticism or positive? And do we feel threatened by the success of others? Or are we in fact more aligned with growth? And although these are presented as binary, I think, we often sort of sit somewhere in between, but it's important to try and lean towards more the growth mindset. And really here intelligence is developmental. So we look at embracing challenges, embracing the unknown, stepping into those unsafe spaces that we don't know what's going to happen. If we find a setback or a roadblock, how do we persist? How do we find our way through, over, around, using different strategies? How do we use effort as a path to mastery? So keeping up at something, how does that help us improve rather than just walking away from it when we don't see immediate reward? How do we learn from criticism? And how do we find lessons and inspiration in the success of others? So again, learning with and learning from as well. And so it's this shift from a hunger for approval to a passion for learning. And I think, we know that learning agility is one of the critical skills of the future. And this is something that we really need to begin developing as well. And you'll see that, my belief is that people with fixed mindsets actually have a very low learning agility. And as we develop more of a growth mindset, this increases. And learning agility is made up of a number of factors. It's, around results agility, change agility, people agility, mental agility, and self-awareness. How well do we deliver results, in challenging sort of first-time situations? How do we experiment? Are we comfortable with change? Can we communicate with people from, diverse backgrounds or diverse groups who are maybe beyond our discipline? How do we look at examining problems in unique or novel ways? And then how do we also acknowledge our strengths and our blind spots? And so this is the learning agility. And it's really about developing these skills to develop the growth mindset. And this is where this idea of sort of an open lifelong learning approach comes from. It's really that fixed mindset, one is quite closed. As soon as we open up, we sort of approach from a sort of an outside-in approach to knowledge. We don't necessarily see ourselves as the expert that knows it all, but rather, the continual learner. Then we create more of an openness to learning. And to me, this is the first step in creating an open lifelong learning strategy. And then the second one is from pedagogy to heutagogy. So how do we become our own guide in learning and knowledge acquisition? When we're at school and university, it's very much a pedagogical approach. It's really much, and the origins of the words are above here, the Greek origins of the words. And this is about sort of leading children, leading young people. And so it's very much teacher-led, teacher-designed, sage on the stage, or at least, very much teacher-curated content. Students are sort of receptors of knowledge, and it's very linear, one way, from teacher to students. And it's about understanding knowledge. What often happens, though, I think, is that because we spend so many years in this approach to learning, we often don't actually develop the autonomy required to drive our own learning at a later stage. And so I think increasingly what we need to do is help young people become self-determined and self-directed learners. And so, once we do move from a pedagogical approach and into more of an andragogical approach, which is sort of more self-directed, but still contained within a knowledge field or knowledge scope. And I think this is where a lot of L&D sits, so learning and development within organizations, very much tied to business strategy. And they're sort of, the content is scoped by the organization, and the content is there to help the organization get to somewhere. And so it's very much objective-based, often organizational objectives, although very much how adults learn as well. So we want to get something done. What do we need to know to do it? That sort of approach. It's bidirectional, so there might be a mentor. And so it is more of a discussion. And it's really about negotiating knowledge and making sense. And then we get heutagogy. And heutagogy is really about leading the self. And this is where there might not be a pathway at all. And this is more how we learn in life, I think, rather than sort of learning it at business or in school or university or college or what have you. And this is very self-determined. So we actually drive the agenda. We drive the focus of our own learning. It's about solving problems, not just meeting an objective. So objective driven could be, for example, learning to drive a car. There's a key objective, we know what we need to do, and we do it. And that's how we learn. But self-determined problem solving is more sort of complex than that. It's more open problems. It's often, it actually starts with framing problems before solving them. We course adjust or course correct based on our own feedback loops that we build. And knowledge here is very multi-directional. So it's cross-disciplinary, it's up, it's down. So one day we're the expert, the next day we're the student. And it's really about creating knowledge and often creating new knowledge. And so we need to develop how we actually drive our own learning agenda. And I'll get into this a little bit more just now as well. And so third, we're going to look at from knowledge management to knowledge strategy. How do we actually not just manage the knowledge we have? So for example, you've got your content and your learning management system, you're on your LMS at work or what have you, and you manage it, based on what's there. How do I access it? When? What do I do with it? How do I apply it in my workplace? It's very much about managing knowledge. Whereas knowledge strategy is more around foresight. It often goes beyond what we're doing today. And in fact, when we talk about strategy, and this is why I love to use chess as the metaphor here, is because we look at three elements. We look at insight, foresight, and hindsight. And you'll see master chess players, tap into all of these. They look at hindsight. What have I done before that's got me, to a checkmate? What have other, top chess players done? How do I learn from them? This is all hindsight. Foresight is more strategic. It's to say, well, if they do this, then I might do this. If this happens, then I might do that. And all of this leads to an insight, which leads to an action, which is the move that happens itself. And so I like to think of lifelong learning as an innovation process, and that embraces these three aspects of insight, foresight, and hindsight. And when I say innovation, I do mean from sort of a nerve endings. It's very much a systemic, inward-looking process. It's about connecting the dots, often inside and even in our mind. From a neuroscience perspective, how do we actually become lifelong learners? And that's through building up habits, through building up strategies, and what have you. And so if we look at these three elements from a visual perspective, we look backwards and we look at what has happened in the past. What is the sort of a series of events that have occurred in the past, whether it's in our own lives, whether it's through other people's lives. And that can lead to an insight, based on what people have done in the past, maybe I should or shouldn't do this. This is how we've often learned through the ages. We look at, these 5 people ate this berry and sort of ended up very ill. My insight is don't eat that berry. And so this is a very sort of ingrained in us. But what often happens is that we make key decisions about the future based on the past. And this in fact can hinder us because the future is unknown and the future contains certain elements that don't exist in the past. And so we need to also look at how do we foster our own foresight? How do we become forward thinkers and not just backwards thinkers? Foresight is a field on its own, and that's a whole masterclass and a whole course on its own. But through, for example, scenario thinking, what are these 3 scenarios that could happen in the future? How do I work backwards from that? And how does that inform my thinking today? And so from a learning perspective, one could say, these are 3 roles that I might want to embody one day, or 3 things that I would like to learn, or 3 future scenarios. Should imagine the internet became all pervasive. Imagine the internet just ceased to exist. Imagine the internet, with 5G, 6G. What are those 3 scenarios, and how does that inform my work or what I want to learn today? And so, we really talk about insights leading to action, and this is informed, as I was saying, by looking backwards, but also cultivating our awareness and our thinking about looking forward. So moving from what is to also what if. And what if questions are very important for driving strategy. And so this is my sort of model that I've come up with around lifelong learning strategies. It's to look forwards, look backwards, have an insight, and then apply that in an action. And whatever that action is, we look at the results. We reflect on our actions, or in our actions as well. Donald Shern wrote about reflecting in action and reflecting on action. And so you do this from a sort of a summative and a formative perspective. And then we change our actions, we course correct. We then see, do I have new insights from this? How do I adjust accordingly, what have you? And so what often happens though, is that even as a lifelong learner, even if we embody a growth mindset, we sometimes get locked into this single loop learning, where all we're doing is course correcting. But double loop learning, which is a learning theory created by Algaris, states that we also need to sometimes reframe our mindset. It comes back to purpose, about why. So instead of just course correcting, sometimes we need to take a step back and say, well, why am I doing this? And so it's this shift from single loop learning, which is just problem solving, and it deals with the what and how. It's about doing things right, to double loop learning, which is questioning oneself, questioning your purpose. It's about problem framing, not just problem solving. It's really about asking why. And it's about doing the right things versus just doing things right. One can refine and refine and refine, but you might be refining the wrong thing completely. And so this to me is a nice model that I like to use for lifelong learning. So it's generating insights, turning them into action, reflecting on that action, reframing our mindset. Was I wrong to even go down this alley or this pathway? How do I course correct? Make sure I'm doing the right thing, even if it's imperfect. At least I'm on the right path. And so this to me is a model that I often use for thinking about lifelong learning. And then the fourth thing, shifting from learning about to learning from and with people in nature. And I do think this is important, is to look at people and nature, to see ourselves as part of the environment, not as separate from it. I think our mindsets of sort of, this people first approach to everything has actually created the problems that we have today, such as, global warming and what have you, because we've been selfish and because we've been people first, to people first. And we always talk about how important a human-centered design is and what have you, but what's I think even more important is to not do that in the bubble of sort of human ego, to really step outside of that and say, well, what is this impact not just on people? I might be solving the needs of people. I might be putting water into plastic bottles so people can drink water very easily, but what's the environmental impact of that? And increasingly designers are solving these sorts of challenges. But I think often the challenges we're solving today are based on the solutions that we came up with, several years ago. So it's really important that we don't think about and we don't try and solve challenges or even start to learn without acknowledging sort of our space within this world, because the current practice cannot be sustained by this one world. And so when I look at learning, I like to combine two models as well to frame, and this comes back to the why, or the double loop learning. Why am I doing this? What is the bigger purpose? What is the strategy behind it? And I like to look at sort of the components of social theory of learning. And so we look at learning as becoming, as our identity, creating who we are. Do I want to see myself as just a design thinker or a learning strategist, or do I want to see myself as a learning strategist who teaches and combines sustainable practice, who understands the complexities of the environment in that space? So who we are can also help us stand out in a field which might not be that sort of heterogeneous. And so how do we create our own identity through learning? And this is also very strategic. How do we carve a niche for ourselves? Then looking at learning as belonging. What community do I actually want to belong to? Or communities of practice, cultural communities, social communities. Community is a very widely used word, but for me, I like to look at it also as a community of practice. Where do I want to belong? Do I want to belong with the people who are creating spaceships and sort of putting myself in space, or do I want to belong with the people that are lifting up the lives of others? What kind of community do I want to survive? Do I want to live in? Do I want to belong in? Where do I feel comfortable? Or where could I grow to feel comfortable? And then learning as experience. And I think learning is very much about meaning making. As we learn, we attach meaning to certain things, and we also make sense of certain things. And we do this through experience. I think learning has to be based in action. I think for example, learning about business to doing business are very different things. And sometimes we learn about and then we go and apply. But I think learning is experience, and it's about meaning making. And then learning is doing as well, very much in practice. So how do we apply what we've understood? How do we apply our learning so that we help create our own identity, that we learn to belong, that we can belong in a certain space, and that we can create future experiences for ourselves? And this all happens, I think, within what Kate Raulworth wrote about donut economics. And she said, we've got the social foundation, and this is around gender equality, equal access, safe drinking water, all the things that form the foundation of society, or should form the foundation of an equal and just society. And then we've got the ecological ceiling, which is around climate change. It's around access to water as a human right. And we need to exist in the space between, because we can't offset the social foundation. We can't go beyond that ecological ceiling. And so our learning, I think, needs to happen in a space that is safe and just for humanity. And that is also regenerative and distributive as an economy. And so these are sort of insights that I like to bring into my own lifelong learning, whatever it may be. And so this is a sort of a model that, if I was to zoom out again, kind of how I like to blend, economics and theory and learning theory. And so to do this, what are some principles or some guidelines that we can actually adhere to? And we're lucky because we live in a world that's billions of years old, and sort of all the life that we have on the planet today is probably about 1% or so of life that has existed in the world. And that's because over the millennia, they have adopted certain strategies for survival, strategies to actually exist and operate and thrive in dynamic equilibrium, which is a state that increasingly us humans are having to live through as well, whether it's because of technology shifts or environmental shifts or what have you. But if we look at double loop learning as well, and where it links and segues so nicely into this, is that Argyris, he wrote that individuals need to adapt themselves to changing environmental conditions, and thus increase their responsiveness. And this comes back to learning agility as well. As we see ourselves also moving not just through linear pathways up through an organization, but across organizations, through different roles, different conditions, whether we're one business might have a very different environment to another. How do we adapt and thrive in these different environments? And the more we can, the more we can actually, the more we can operate, I think, in a world that is so ever changing. And so to look at these conditions that exist in nature, around adapting to changing conditions, being locally attuned and responsive, evolving to survive, integrating development with growth, being resource efficient. These are principles that we can apply to our own life. And what I'll do next is just share some ways in which I've applied these, for example, into my own lifelong learning practice. So to start off with, if we look at, for example, evolve to survive, some subcategories here are replicate strategies that work, integrate the unexpected, reshuffle information. And so from a very practical perspective, some things one can do is, if you're wanting to learn something, maybe there's some key information that you can write on Post-its and just stick them around your house, whether it's on your fridge, next to your bed. So as you're walking past it, you're seeing this information constantly. And then you can mix these up. shift the post-its around. You're reshuffling this information and sort of seeing it in different ways, and this can help it stick, become more sticky. Go out and speak to others. Ask others how, when, and where they learn best. And then what's more important, instead of just asking these questions, is test them for yourself. So learning to me is experimentation, and vice versa. We all say celebrate failure, but I think what's more important than celebrating failure is actually celebrating the learnings from failure. We can win, but I think when we fail, that often presents even more learnings. So don't be afraid to fail, but I think see your life, see your learning as an experiment. And then a nice way to also integrate the unexpected, which is sort of introducing lateral thinking into our learning as well, is we can go oblique. And this is a term that Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt termed. And there's a Twitter page there, Oblique Chirps, if you want to just make a note of it. What I love about this is that these are sort of simple, very simple cards that have very simple prompts on them. So when, Brian Eno, when he was writing music and he got stumped, he would look at one of these cards, and it might be, what would your enemy do? Or, if you were to step outside the room, what would the problem look like? Or, what would a superhero do to solve this challenge? Or things like that. And these sort of introduce the unknown into your learning process as well, and are really fantastic for thinking about things slightly differently. And then adapt to changing conditions. This is about incorporating diversity, which again comes back to an open lifelong learning strategy. How do we incorporate diversity into our learning? How do we maintain integrity through self-renewal? How do we embody resilience through variation, redundancy, and decentralization? And I think what's incredibly important for lifelong learning is to engage with people outside of our discipline, outside of our work function and our culture. I think innovation happens at the intersection of different fields. And I think this is where the most learning is. And it's also a fantastic way to carve a niche for yourself. So, explore disciplinary intersections, for example, biology and business. And if you look at biomimicry, for example, that's at the intersection of biology, business, ecology, and engineering. What is at the intersection of technology and dance? And a fun activity to do often is to just take two completely separate fields and say, what would these look like if they were to intersect? And that's often a good way to then, I think, drive our own learning. So in fact, this is a sort of a niche area that I'd like to grow. This is how I would like to carve a space for myself in this field, as someone who operates at the intersection of these two fields. So no longer just a specialist, but more of a generalist as well. I think it's incredibly important to ask not just what is questions, and we're looking at sort of the status quo or current circumstances, but what if? And the more what if questions we ask, the more we sort of prompt our futures thinking and our scenario thinking that we can move into. And we become more comfortable with the unknown by asking what if questions, because it helps us experiment today. Although we can't predict the future, we can only create it. I think by asking what if questions, this really helps us broaden our scope of possibility for how we might move into the future. And then, as I said just now as well, experiment daily, do things differently, break your habits that you do have, stop doing certain things, do new things, see your day-to-day as an experiment, whether that's just taking a slightly different route to work, whether it's about, learning something from it in a way that you haven't learned from it before, whether that's, shifting from reading to podcasts, whatever it may be, experiment daily, because the more little experiments we can run, the more comfortable we become with experimenting. Getting lost on the way to the shops as an experiment doesn't really impact your life too much. But you do a lot of these little experiments and you become slightly more confident with doing larger experiments. And so it's building up our confidence in experimenting. And so a good way to start is just to do these things daily. And then be locally attuned and responsive. And if we look at the categories within here, it's about leveraging cyclical processes. We can see these as feedback loops. And obviously, the smaller the feedback loop, the quicker that we can learn and move ahead. use readily available materials and energy, use feedback loops, like I was saying, cultivate cooperative relationships. So embrace double loop learning, and be aware of when we're actually just doing single loop learning. And my thinking as well about single loop learning is that it's so pervasive. Even fantastic ways of working. If we look at sort of agile, build, test, learn. Fantastic approach to refining an idea, but it's very much aligned with single loop learning. It's about refining as opposed to defining. And I think we need to build in this double loop learning into our workplaces as well. Start where you are with what you have, with what you have. So what I often see is people sort of saying, I want to learn this. I'm going to go out, I'm going to find all this material, I'm going to create my learning strategy, I'm going to do all these things. And they spend so much time planning that they often get left behind, or the future sort of happens, and the scenario that they're operating within changes. And so they have to go back to the drawing board. And so I think what's incredibly important here is just start, and I'll touch on a few ways in which you can just get started tomorrow, for example, with your lifelong learning strategy. I'll do that just now. Looking at build a collaborative learning community. Learning, especially learning on your own, can be intimidating. So find a community of learners where you can share your failures, share your wins with each other. Look at understanding your environment. Take a step back and look at it from an outsider's perspective, whether that's at work or home, your commute. What are your environments that you interact with in the day? Where would be best for learning? If, for example, you spend an hour commuting, whether it's on the car train or stuck in traffic, maybe an audiobook is a good place to start, learning, whatever it may be. So look at your environment and start to think about where you could learn. Be resource efficient. So use low energy processes, multifunctional design, fit form to function. Function is a core aspect of biomimicry, and it's very much around purpose, and I'll touch on that now as well. But a good starting point here is to understand our flow state. Flow state is that space between we become too stressed or too easy. And so if we look at gaming, for example, if a game is too easy, we get bored, we disassociate from it, and we move on to something else. If it's too challenging, we get frustrated and we move on to something else. And so a flow state is something in between, where we actually really thrive. We don't notice, for example, time going by. So what's really useful, what you can do today or tomorrow, is make a list of the last time that you felt in the zone when you were doing something or learning something. When were you sort of in this state where time just flew by? And how do you replicate that into your learning strategies, or recreate that? I think what's also important is to explore different ways to learn and approach knowledge and skill from different angles. So whether it's speaking to someone, whether it's listening to it, whether it's about reading about something, whether it's about doing something, approach it from different ways. If you're wanting to learn, for example, how to play the guitar, that you can learn music theory, you can pick up a guitar and just start playing, you can watch YouTube videos. There's so much information out there now that we really can begin curating our own content around learning. And then frame learning outcomes as verbs. And this links to purpose, it links to the why. What is it that you're trying to do? And then you can begin curating your content and processes accordingly. Do you really need to learn to play the guitar? Or do you just need to learn 3 chords to write, a loved one a song? What is the outcome? What is the purpose of what you're trying to do? Because this helps you curate. You don't have to learn music theory. You don't have to do all these things. You can just learn these 2 or 3 chords, learn how to strum, and you can, woo a partner or a potential partner. So think about what is the purpose for your action before diving in. And then integrate development with growth. So looking at self-organizing, and this is obviously linked very much with self-determined learning. Build from the bottom up and combine modular and nested components. And so a good place to start as well is, once you know your why, create a learning plan and then adjust it accordingly based on practice. What is the purpose of what you're doing? What is the duration? How long do you want to give yourself to do something? What tools or media could you use? What are your success metrics? How do you know you're actually advancing? And then another way is to learn by chunking. And I love this term. It's really about breaking down complex activities or processes into smaller pieces and then building from the bottom up. And so look at all these different elements that you're wanting to do and then put them together in a new way and build from the bottom up so you can build your learning strategy. And then create tiny learning habits. And this I found is such a fantastic way to approach lifelong learning, because although learning is acquired, habits are created. And I think through creating certain habits, we can become much better learners. And so I've got a couple of activities. If you've got some sort of a pen and paper, these won't go live or anything. These are just for you. I would love to prompt you to just grab a pen and paper or your keyboard if that's nearer. And I'd like you to actually, as we're talking now, create a learning habit for yourself. And if we look at the work of BJ Fogg, in his work around tiny habits, it's really simple to create a new habit. It's very hard to break habits, but it's very easy to create new ones, which is a good thing. And so what you want to do is find an anchor moment, which is something that you do every day, or maybe a scenario in which you find yourself every day. This is an existing routine that you have. It could be brushing your teeth, putting on the kettle, something that you do every day. And then what behavior do you want to attach to that? So create something new and make it tiny. So a very small action, something that might take, for example, less than 30 seconds. And then what's important is to celebrate instantly. And this is sort of a 3-step formula we can use to create habits. And if we apply this to learning and lifelong learning, here are some examples. So for example, after I open my laptop in the morning, I will watch one random TED Talk. Okay, so every day I have to open my laptop, but instead of diving straight into emails, I'll give myself 10 minutes, for example, and just pick a random TED Talk. This also helps, bring diversity into my knowledge. Helps, with my unknown unknowns. Watching a talk on a field that I have nothing about, might actually give me some insight into my own field. And so this is a healthy, learning habit that I can create, and it sets me up for the day in a different way than I would if I just went through the same process every morning. Or it can be something a little bit more complex. For example, every time I feel anxious, I will lean into it rather than try to avoid it. And so the more that I do that, the more, if I'm going into a scenario where I think, oh, I feel uncomfortable, and I lean into it versus, avoidance. And obviously, this is sort of safety issues and things like that aside. But, if I go into a meeting and I'm normally quite quiet, let me speak up and see what happens. And the more that we do that, the more we step into our outside of our comfort zone, the more we extend it. And that's where learning really happens, is just outside of the comfort zone. And so I think as lifelong learners, we need to constantly step outside our comfort zone. So just take 2 minutes. You can use this sort of Mad Lib of after I do something, I will something. I'm going to keep quiet for a minute. And I'd like you to just grab a pen, some paper, and write yourself one learning habit that you can do maybe tomorrow morning. So you can really just get started straight away. I've just looked at the time as well. So if you don't do this now, no worries. Try and do it maybe after the talk and get started tomorrow morning. And then another activity which is really useful and really helps sort of introduce the unknown, and it also helps as a sort of success metric, activity that I love to do and I love to share with people, is to write a letter to your future self. Now, we obviously don't have time to do this now, but if you go to futureme.org, this is a site that's set up exactly for that, where you can write a letter to yourself. Maybe it's about, by this stage, I would love to be able to play 3 chords on a guitar. And at this stage, maybe I would have performed 1 song live in a group of people, whatever it may be. What is a future learning that you would like to achieve? Write it to yourself, give yourself a time, and then on that day, you'll receive an email from yourself, essentially. And you can check in with yourself. And so this is a fun thing to do on a sort of a regular basis as well. So futureme.org. And that's it. That's it for this evening from my side. I would love to connect. I'd love to continue to speak to people about lifelong learning, whether that's challenges they're facing, whether it's insights that they have from their own practice. So please do connect, whether that's on LinkedIn or if you want to send me an email directly. My email is my name, Rael Futerman @cartito.com. But yeah, I'd love to engage with you further. I hope this was insightful. I'm going to stop sharing, and if we've got some time, maybe open the floor for questions, comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rael Futerman. This was an awesome session. I really loved it. I really loved each and every bit of it, especially the fact that, everything starts with I, and us going into the growing journey and the learning journey. This has been amazing. So I'll hand over to Moroma and Andisiwa, who will take us through some of the questions in the chats.
Thank you, Dr. Rael. So the first question here says, how does one know which skills they need to learn to stay relevant, to be happy, and to grow?
Sure. So I think that's a very subjective question, because happiness comes from, I think, within. And so I would hate to tell other people how to be happy. What skills I do and what I do make me happy. They maybe make me stay relevant in my field, but might not apply to someone else. So I think over there, it's very much an experiment. Again, it comes down to futures thinking. Imagine your profession in 5, 10, 20 years, and create 3 stories. Look at those and start to think about what skills might I need, in 10 years' time, in 2 years' time, and then work backwards and say, okay, well, what can I do now to start either growing those skills or developing them? And I think, relevance again as well is subjective to different fields. For example, there's a massive, push for towards coding, and how coding is the next language. I myself know nothing about coding, well, very little. But I work with in my field, although I work in data science and product development, and digital and all of that, I'm a non-technical founder. And so for me to stay relevant is really looking into kind of motivation, what drives people, what makes people want to learn. And then I work with a group of people who are fantastic at actually developing the products and realizing that. And so I think, focus on how you grow your own niche, but also how you grow a diverse group set of people around you who can also help you stay relevant. And I hope that helps that question.
Thank you, Doctor. We've got another question from Andrew Scott that says, how does digital transformation and AI, artificial intelligence, influence learning across age?
Sorry, is that in the chat?
Yes, it's in the chat.
Yes. How does digital transformation and AI influence learning across age?
Yes.
And it's a big question. So to me, AI is fantastic in that it, and the smart, if we look at the way that things are shifting, where AI, I think, is great is that it can help us learn, and it can actually look at making learning easier. So for example, if we look at the forgetting curve, and this is how, after we've learned something new, over a period of time, for example, we're going to forget up to 80% of that. But with AI, if it understands our habits, if it understands our learning patterns, it can actually deliver us content exactly when we need it to keep remembering. And so for me, AI is a fantastic contributor to potentially learning. It's something that we work with in soft skills development, looking at delivering the right kind of learning at the right time. And so that's how I see AI influencing learning. If it's across age, it's also how do we maybe adapt learning to us as individuals rather than adapting us to learning. In the past, we would have, learning was very much happened, in a building, at a place. And if we weren't at that place, we wouldn't get the knowledge. But I think increasingly AI and digital transformation is flipping that, where it's putting humans at the center of learning and from a more distributed perspective, and then delivering more individualistic learning content to people when and how they need it. So I think it helps us learn better than if we were all sort of going through the same curriculum at the same time. And that to me is how it can help maybe drive or influence learning over time.
Oh, thank you, Doctor, for that one. The next question says, how do learning and development learning initiatives and strategies align with business analysts for lifelong learning? So how do we align business analyst initiatives with L&D's lifelong learning strategies?
So I think for me, and again, I'm not a business analyst, so you've got far more insight to the field than I do. But the few insights that I have is shifting just from analysis to also strategy, and looking at embracing not just what is, but what if. So, if we look at the concept that no new idea has ever been proven analytically beforehand, then how do we analyze the future and the unknown? We can't. So but we can experiment. And so for me, learning and development initiatives that are created or curated for organizations or fields that are very analytical in their approach, I think need to bring in this idea of experimentation. And I guess experimentation is learning, because increasingly, we can't just analyze what is, but we need to sort of experiment what if. And sometimes that goes beyond just, existing data sets, for example. And so I think for me, that's one way to look at lifelong learning, as well as to look at the shifting field of business analysis, where it's growing, and creates opportunities for people to go beyond current practice into potential future practice. And that, I think, could inform, L&D content.
Cool. And then thank you. And then the next one, it's really more of a comment, which I agree with. It says, I found that the tips provided in the presentation makes the journey less daunting. Thank you. And then another great one, it says, thank you, Dr. Rael, for such an insightful presentation. My takeaway is to be intentional in my learning and development journey.
Yeah, absolutely. If we can't be passive in our learning journey, it doesn't just happen to us. If we don't intentionally create our own learning pathways, we fall in line with other people's intentions and other people's. And I think increasingly it's important to create your own strategy, your own why, find your own purpose, and drive towards that.
We have another question, Doctor. It says, please detail foresight as opposed to hindsight and connect to insight.
Sure. So hindsight is linked into reflection. It's looking backwards and making sense of what has come before. Foresight is a skill that I think is increasingly important, which is about imagining different futures, and then working backwards from that. So it's sort of instead of looking at what has been and then making a decision, which is basically more deductive and inductive thinking, we look at more abductive thinking. So what if this, or what if that, taking these creative leaps, and then working backwards from that to an insight. An insight is sort of an aha moment that we have now based on either looking forwards or looking backwards. And that informs our actions. So for example, if we're in a car, and we know that a certain stretch of road often has traffic at a certain time, that's hindsight. Our insight is to avoid that that session or that section of road. Foresight might be like, well, I could go this route, or this route. Let's test them out, and maybe I find a route that's far, far quicker. A very simplified version, but it's about looking at sort of different scenarios that don't yet exist, and then how we might get insights from the future.
Thank you. Another interesting question. Is learning because of fear of being redundant an attitude of a fixed mindset?
No, I don't think so. I think learning because of fear of redundant goes beyond sort of a fixed or growth mindset and touches on something more sort of psychological. The world is changing so rapidly. It's easy. I think, people are scared. And we need to acknowledge that things are changing so quickly and far quicker than they have in the past. How do we adapt? And so I think what's important there is although you might approach learning as from a place of redundancy, it is a good prompt to then begin to look at, how do I then create a learning strategy where I don't feel scared or I don't feel like I'm going to be redundant. And I think it's about shifting from that. So, that feeling of redundancy might start, with maybe upskilling, but then maybe you move into sort of reskilling and think, in fact, how can I apply what I know in a different field where maybe it's novel? And so I think that's where diversity and speaking to different people from different spaces is so useful, like I was saying earlier, I come from a background of design, but I very quickly got bored with working in, for example, CAD. I enjoyed designing sort of furniture and bicycles and all these things, but I didn't enjoy necessarily working in CAD. And CAD software was developing, and I could see so many people around me developing so much quicker and producing beautiful portfolios of work. And so I started to feel redundant. And so, and what I began to do was say, well, what do I know about design? How can I apply this to different spaces other than, physical products? And so I began to move more into learning and applied that sort of design thinking before, the big design thinking boom, but applied that thinking in different spaces. And so I think a good place to say, well, am I redundant in my own field? But just although you might feel redundant, your knowledge isn't. I think your knowledge can always inform another field. So this is where that sort of working across different disciplines is so important.
The last question that we're taking, it's from Andrew, and it reads, the learning continuum you presented, how does it align with the learning distress these days in virtual business drive?
How does it align with the stress these days in virtual business drive? I don't quite understand that question. What do you mean by virtual business drive, Andrew, if you're still on the call? I see Andrew's next question is, how do we reach out to you?
Yeah, yes.
Maybe what we can do is take this offline and I can have a conversation with you, Andrew. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and that might be a good place to start. Otherwise, please do just connect with me on LinkedIn. It's a quick way to do that. And then we can chat about how we might work virtually. So, as I was saying earlier, working virtually. So, I do work predominantly virtually and hybrid. And like I was saying, my business partner is based in India. Our clients are based in, Burundi, Angola, Uganda, India, across the world as well. So very much work in a virtual space. And so happy to connect and look at how one might collaborate virtually. But please just do reach out. Maybe we can have a call and talk.
All right, then. Thank you so much again, Doctor. And then in closing, we would like to say that thank you so much for taking time to sharing with us so much information, especially as well the activities that we can take home with us and actually, practice them. And with that said, that thank you for everybody who has joined us again. And just remember that you can find this recording on YouTube. And till we meet again in our next tools and techniques session. Thank you so much and good evening, everybody.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, this is, like I said, this is something I'm passionate about and happy to talk about further.